Previously on the American Justice Podcast.
Welcome to this edition of the SAU Report. I'm Casey Body. With me today is Charla Woodruff, a co-founder of SWIC. Charla, thank you for being with us today. Charla, what is your major here at SAU?
I'm currently a criminal justice major, and I chose this major because ever since I was young, I imagined being a cop, and I don't know if it was a fascination with guns or if it was the authority or, just the power. You're just like, yeah.
There is an epidemic in America's criminal justice system: the prosecution and conviction of innocent people for crimes they did not commit. Welcome to American Justice. The American Justice Podcast Army works to free men and women wronged by the criminal justice system. It's not only about the innocent who have been imprisoned, but also the victims of the crimes as well. No one deserves justice more than them. And now, here's your host, Scott Poggensee.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the American Justice Podcast. Last week, we discussed the missing gun, Dennis and Norma's funeral, and some key observation of their children's behavior at their funeral service. If you're joining us for the very first time, I'd like to recommend that you return to our previous episodes and bring yourself up to speed on the Brandon Woodruff capital murder case. This week, we're going to discuss Brandon's sister, Charla Woodruff. The clip you just heard is an old interview with Charla Woodruff from the campus television station at Southern Arkansas University. She, along with several other girls, were establishing a group where females across the SAU campus and across Magnolia could be escorted to their dorm room or home in situations where they felt unsafe. During this interview, Charla expressed to the interviewer that she was a criminal justice major. The reason Charla stated she was interested in being a police officer went back and forth from the authority of being a cop to the power that she would have to her fascination with guns. Nope, no red flags here whatsoever. To be fair and to understand where Charla's state of mind resides during this interview, we must go back to her childhood and teenage years. American Justice Podcast has obtained over 500 pages of various documentation, and along with family interviews, we have been able to construct a timeline of events that reveal a troubled childhood full of family problems, violence, and suicide attempts. I can tell you from a personal view, it was very difficult to see Dennis and Norma Woodruff's names and signatures all over these pages as they tried earnestly to get their daughter the help she needed. Now, not to take away from the investigation of the Woodruff murder case, but I think it's very important that we understand the psyche and state of mind of all the key players involved in this story. After all, that's the purpose of a podcast, isn't it? To dive deep into the facts and evidence of a case, but also to understand the backstory. This will give you information that unfortunately the jurors would never get. However, the American Justice Army gets to hear all the facts, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Also, just to add some disclaimers and CYA points here, I am in no way stating or implying that any of this information indicates that Charla was involved in her parents' murders. I'm not saying she was, and I'm not saying she wasn't. What I am saying is that if I'm going to ask you, the remote listening jury, to make up your own mind and to come to an informed conclusion at the end of this season, it's going to be necessary to understand everyone's background and point of view. You're going to need more than just what was presented to the general public, or even the jury. I feel it's important that you know the state of mind of everyone that surrounded Dennis and Norma at the time of their deaths. As I said in the beginning of this season, I was able to review tens of thousands of documents that made up all of the evidence. All I'm trying to do is make you privy to what I was able to review. And don't worry, at some point we'll cover Brandon's medical and psychiatric background as well. Actually, I guess we can just do that now. Brandon fell off a horse when he was 14 and had to go to the hospital because he broke both of his ankles. There we have it. All done. There's nothing at all that deals with mental issues, violence, or self-harm. Nothing. Not a single word, written or spoken, by any medical expert that would ever lead anyone to believe that he was capable of harming any living thing, especially his own parents. His family knew this. His closest friends knew this. Yet, somehow, it all meant next to nothing to the so-called independent investigators when starting to form their theories on who could have committed such a heinous and unspeakable crime. Up until the point of the murders, there had never been a word uttered by any of Brandon's family, friends, or anyone that knew the boy that would indicate he had any kind of murderous bone in his body. Even after the murders, no one came forward to say they had any indication that Brandon could do this, other than the shit kickers, that is. Before Brandon's arrest, Mike Etherington and his mom Norma were the only ones that ever came forward to say that Brandon had any kind of homicidal tendency. Then, once their quote-unquote information helped arrest Brandon, the rest of the merry band of misfits jumped right in. Joe Hageman and Dustin Perry also gave interviews saying that Brandon was leading an alternative lifestyle and was capable of committing the double homicide himself. Let that sink in for just a moment. Oh, and one last person. Let's not forget his sister Charla. As mentioned before, she gave 2 on-camera interviews with Ranger Collins. The first was a day before Brandon was arrested, and the second was a couple days after he was in jail. As you'll see later on, these 2 interviews couldn't be more different. So without further ado, let's talk about her. So, it's time to take a little trip into the Wayback Machine to visit the bumpy teenage years of one Charla Annette Woodruff. Trust me, you'll thank me when I'm done, while simultaneously scratching your head in confusion regarding the eventual outcome of this case. Okay, let's start with when this information of her troubled past became known to the investigators. The medical and psychiatric records which verified Charla Woodruff's strife with her parents and brother would be received by Ranger Collins in May of 2006, some 8 months after the Woodruff's murders and Brandon's arrest, and long before the case ever went to trial. However, Ranger Collins never raised an eyebrow to the multiple, easily apparent warning signs of her potentially violent outbursts, or just never bothered to read them at all. Personally, I'm not a cop. In fact, I'm nowhere close, but multiple points of alarm automatically spring from the pages of these documents with very little effort. However, by the time these records had finally surfaced, Ranger Collins and his gaggle of investigators had already had another suspect in jail, Charla's brother Brandon. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not making any kind of personal accusation. I'm nowhere near qualified to do so. But if it was my job to point out a suspect based strictly on psychiatric stability, Brandon Woodruff would still be standing at the starting line of life's mental racetrack, while Charla would be doing burnouts in Victory Lane. Okay. One last thing before we get into the nuts and bolts of Charla's issues. Please know that this is not a bashing session by any means. I want to make that very clear. I'm simply relaying facts as provided to me by a myriad of different sources, including some that tell the story from back when all of this was actually going on. However, in no way am I saying that someone who has issues with aggression, depression, and family violence is automatically a murderer. In fact, quite the opposite. There has been no physical evidence to support any theory that Charla had any involvement in her parents' murders. No murder weapon found in her car, no DNA showing her blood at the crime scene. None of that. She may have had opportunity, means, and a motive, but that's a story for another time, or another episode. You won't want to miss that one, trust me. Please also keep in mind that everything stated in the minutes to follow have been researched thoroughly and verified by her family, friends, and the notes provided to the American Justice podcast. There was also an extensive analysis of her past medical and psychiatric past done for the lawyers just prior to trial. Nothing is fictional or has been exaggerated for the sake of entertainment. It's cold, hard facts. Now, we begin with her first unstable episode at the beginning of her teenage years. The following is a recreation compiled from several different personal and detailed notes provided to me by a family member of Charla's that they made back at the time this was all going on. I have been able to obtain information from several different sources, including Charla's interview herself. She readily offered up information to Ranger Collins of her psychiatric background, troubles with her parents and brother, as well as her violent outbursts. Now, I know what you're thinking to yourself right now. Wow, if Charla told Ranger Collins all that, he surely must have looked at her as a suspect from the very beginning. Well, I hate to disappoint you, but you'd be wrong. Now, as not to violate any privacy laws, I have removed specific dates and times that were told to me from this summary. I cannot give the specific medical facilities or the doctor's names, but the general time frame would be when Charla was around 14 or 15 years old, approximately 5 years before her parents would be slaughtered in their own home. Unfortunately, this is only the beginning of the information that we have been told.
Charla is a 15-year-old white female who last night took a large number of aspirin and about 17 200-milligram tablets of Zestril.
Just a quick note so you know what's going on here. Zestril is a medication taken for high blood pressure. It's what's called an ACE inhibitor. The main concern with Zestril overdose would be that her blood pressure would bottom out, which would send her body into respiratory distress or failure. All right. Back to the summary.
She apparently did this around 2 a.m. She also states that she took one of her sleeping pills. She was brought to the emergency room by her parents. According to the patient, she had multiple episodes of vomiting prior to this. She does not recall if she had any pill fragments in the emesis. She freely admits that she was suicidal and even admits to me at this time that she wants to die. She said this in a rather cavalier attitude. According to Charla, she was feeling depressed because none of her friends were at home and her family was out of the house. She felt like her friends had given up on her. After speaking with the parents, she apparently had recently broken up with her boyfriend and had some issues with many of her girlfriends at school. I asked Charla if the boyfriend issue was a precipitating factor, and she said it was not because she wanted to break up with him. Charla says she feels like no one really cares about her and that her parents' rules are too restrictive. She feels like she has no one that is really there for her.
That was actually Charla's second suicide attempt. On Easter, after her brother told her that he hated her and her parents left her alone at the house, she apparently picked up a gun and said she was going to kill herself. She had been seeing a psychiatrist and a psychologist in the past and reported she'd improved with some of her symptoms. The good doctor discussed this with the family, and they said that the reason she improved was because she wanted to go on a trip to Arkansas to visit her aunt, who is much closer to her age, and her attitude changed. Following the episode at Easter, she began having quote-unquote seizures. These were spells to where she would be unresponsive and would twitch with no recollection of it. There was no loss of bladder or bowel control, and there were no injuries noted. These were addressed as what are called pseudo-seizures. According to the family, the last one occurred just prior to them giving her permission to go to Arkansas. They informed her that she would have to drop out of school, drop out of drill team, not attend driver's ed, and not get a driver's license if she continued to have seizures. Well, wouldn't you know, they suddenly, magically stopped. Okay, hold on right there. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the term pseudo-seizures, that basically means that your seizures are not physical in nature. In other words, there's no disorder of the brain or neurological explanation why you're having seizures. In fact, WebMD defines pseudo-seizures this way. Pseudo-seizures, also called psychogenic non-epileptic seizures, are seizures that occur as a result of psychological causes rather than a physiological etiology. All right, moving on from then, the family reported that she did pretty well over the summertime when she was with her aunt and recently had some flares to where she would just go into a rage. Apparently, the issues are over her not being able to talk on the phone after 9 o'clock or being on the internet after 10. She told the doctor that her other friends are able to do this and she feels left out because she's not able to. She feels that since she is not able to do these things, that her friends do not want to participate in things with her. The information obtained showed that Charla was active in school, and she said that she made good grades. The family reports no real significant school problems other than her missing school occasionally. Charla denied any sexual activity or any sexual abuse or misconduct. She denied any physical abuse, but considers that she is possibly emotionally abused whenever her parents get mad at her. This would be the very beginning of Charla's accusations of verbal abuse from her parents. Although she would eventually tell Ranger Collins while sitting in the interview room with him that her dad physically abused her, at this time, there was never any utterance of anything like that. Another part of the information we were able to obtain showed that Charla's past medical history was remarkable for bipolar disorder in addition to the pseudo-seizures.
C. Derick Miller is an author, producer, and gonzo journalist from the conservative community of Greenville, Texas. Sam Cloud Miller is a graphic artist and a liberal civil rights activist from Austin, Texas. Combine those two and what do you have? Magic. Recorded in the Bishop Arts District of Dallas, it's a podcast that is sure to never disappoint. They talk about books, film, music, today's topics, and life in general. Even though they may disagree on the topics from time to time, they'll always kiss and make up. It's a practice that America needs to relearn, don't you think? No filters, no scripts, and no schedule. Catch the Butterflies Make Me Angry podcast on Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, and YouTube. Peace to the peaceful, truth to the masses, hell to the tyrants. Get all the details at cderickmiller.com.
All right, back to the hospital stay. Remember, Charla was being hospitalized for supposedly taking a handful of Zestril, a drug that bottoms out your blood pressure when taken by healthy people that do not have hypertension. Yet all throughout her stay in the ER and eventually in the ICU, her blood pressure was never documented less than 120s over 80s. Her O2 saturations were never below 99%. The 120s systolic is normal for a human being over the age of 8. Charla's medications were reported by this informant to be birth control pills and Zoloft. Whoops, wait, what? Birth control pills? At this point, she's a 15-year-old girl. I've been able to ask the family members, and no one has been able to confirm or deny that Dennis and Norma knew that she was taking birth control. Either way, it is what it is. Next, this particular family member made very detailed notes about what the next steps were. Charla, being diagnosed previously with bipolar disorder, just complicated things. It would seem that it would be very difficult for the good doctor to let her just go home with this, because if she went home and actually did kill herself, he could be on the hook for it. So he recommended inpatient treatment, and soon thereafter, into the psychiatric lockdown she went. So that's it for her first visit to the ER that this family member was able to document and remember. Instead of going through every single time Charla was treated, counseled, or admitted to the hospital for her psychological issues, let's look at a summary that Dr. Christy Compton of Dallas made after reviewing all of Charla's medical records with the psychiatrist that treated her most of the time. It's unclear from the records we were able to obtain why Dr. Compton was reviewing the charts, but it's assumed that it was either for the state or the defense in preparation for trial. She summarizes Charla's records like this.
Intake form. Charla is noted to have been depressed since Easter. Notations reflect anger, fights with Brandon, and, quote, attacks dad, unquote. It is not noted whether the attacks are verbal or physical. She has tried to shoot herself 3 times. Suicidal individuals have given up all hope and are showing signs of impaired reality. There is a fine line between being suicidal and homicidal. Doctor recommends to lock up guns and medication. She was taking Zoloft 150 milligrams, an antidepressant, since July of 2000. Past medications included Effexor, an antidepressant, Doxepin, an antidepressant, and Topomax, an anti-epileptic drug. Reportedly, she had a sudden onset of seizures with sudden termination. This is atypical of biological seizures and suggests a psychological origin. She was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder with a late onset and major depressive disorder. She was being treated by Dr. Doyle Carson, a psychiatrist. On 11/1/2000, Charla overdosed on aspirin and blood pressure medications. Dr. Yingling recommended hospitalization. A notation showing, quote, a change of diagnosis, unquote, was made, but not indicative of what the diagnosis was changed to. On 11/15/2000, suicide notes were found in her room, and she was involuntarily committed to Glen Oaks. On 11/12/2001, she was admitted again to Glen Oaks without documentation as to the reason why. During this time, she complained that Dennis was abusing her. It appears that he, quote, threatened her to go to school, but denies hitting her, unquote. Nonetheless, it is quite telling that she was claiming abuse to her therapist. There were indications that she could be put in residential treatment. Only those who have profound and severe mental illness are placed in residential treatment. On 2/27/2001, Yingling writes, quote, concerned with extreme anger towards family members without explanation or justification, unquote. Of note, extreme anger can lead to violent behavior. This note also reveals that Charla claimed to have been molested by a daycare worker 10 years ago, but never revealed this to family members, hence the diagnosis of PTSD. However, this would not account for anger toward the family.
Okay, that should give you a little bit of background about Charla before we move on to the next subject, the interviews. We're now bringing you out of the Wayback Machine and back to the current time of October 23rd, 2005, exactly 1 week after the Woodruffs were believed to have been killed. As we described in an earlier episode, 3 family members were interviewed this particular Sunday, and 1 was interrogated. Brandon's aunts Kathy and Linda were first, followed by Charla, and then ultimately Brandon was last. Before we talk about Charla's first interview, I'd like to make some personal observations. See? I told you I'd try to warn you whenever I start talking about my personal opinions. Needless to say, teenage Charla Woodruff was determined to end her young life for reasons that, up until that point, we could only speculate. Why would a young girl from what others had described as a typical American family want to cease living rather than ride the American dream into adulthood. Perhaps it's worth noting that not everything is always as it seems. Sometimes, even the most normal-looking families will have all kinds of serious drama that the outsider would never see. As a matter of fact, it's quite typical of our lifestyle in this wonderful country of ours. Just drive down any historical street in any town USA and take a gander at the restored, classic-style houses on display. The front of the house is immaculate, but from time to time, a quick glance over the picket fence or into a window will reveal the home's true identity. Sometimes, the backyard is unkempt and the rear of the home is disintegrating from exposure to time and the elements. Oftentimes, the inside of the home itself is a hoarder's dream containing piles of old newspapers and enough dust-covered antiques to make walking from room to room nearly impossible. All that matters is what the average passerby can see from the street: the sparkly front exterior. A lot of people are built the same way as these houses: 80s-style glamour shot smiles, complete with poofy, hairspray-soaked bangs on the outside, and haunted from within. Being a medical professional myself, I've met dozens of people over the years who would love for their own involuntary, horrific seizures to end with a simple wish. But then again, these individuals are not partaking in the life-threatening activity of seizures as an attention-seeking tactic. After all, if a person will fake something as serious as a seizure, what other theatrical hijinks do they have up their sleeve? From what I can gather from the family members' notes, it all seemed to deal with a personal dislike of rules, boundaries, if you will. Reasonable limitations on simple things set forth by parental authorities, perhaps created in order to keep peace and order within their own household. We all had them as kids, I'm sure, and we all hated them equally. At that point in our lives, those rules our parents made up were unworthy of our agreement, and every single one of us tried to skirt them in one way or another. But I don't recall any of them making me fake seizures or attempt suicide, no matter how unfair I believed them to be. After all, many of the rules and boundaries set forth by our parents eventually translated into laws once we reached our adult lives. Statistically, as a child, if you have a strong disdain for one, then the other won't mean much to you when the time of adulthood arrives. Any juvenile officer with an extended amount of time on the job can tell you that from watching their youthful offenders transition into the adult system after time. All right, personal observation complete. I believe I've rambled enough.
It's vacation planning season. You know what that means. Countless hours of planning, internet searching, and price comparing for your next trip. Don't you want to know if you're getting the best deal for your hard-earned cash? Now you can take the stress away and let an experienced certified travel agent do all the work for you. After all, time is money, and you shouldn't waste either. Call Tiffany Elvington of ET Family Travel at 903-408-7230 or email tiffanie.elvington@gmail.com. Tiffany's services are always 100% free to you. Now, if you mention you heard about her on the American Justice podcast, you will receive a free gift when your trip is booked and paid. Stop stressing over something that's supposed to relax you and call Tiffany. You won't regret it. Again, Tiffany's phone number is 903-408-7230, and her email is tiffanie.elvington@gmail.com. Also, even if you don't really know where you want to go, Tiffany can help you decide. She has real-world experience with all of the best destinations. Call or email her today.
To lay the groundwork for these interviews, we have to keep in mind that both siblings had never experienced any real legal proceedings outside of a mishap or two at school when they were younger. Those irrelevant tribunals were nothing compared to the closed-door sessions with law enforcement officials on the horizon. Alone, neither of them would be a match for the highly trained Texas lawmen. Since that would definitely be the case, a member of the family called in a favor to prevent the two from going into the proceedings blindly. Brandon and Charla were both represented in the interview room by their Aunt Linda's boss, Leroy Autry, and his son, also a lawyer. Linda worked at a law firm in Texarkana that dealt with family and civil law. But we'll get into Mr. Autry's role in all of this in much more detail later on when we talk about Brandon's interrogation. Let's just suffice it to say that when someone is interrogating you for a double homicide, you probably want to opt for criminal attorneys, not civil and family custody attorneys. But Mr. Autry sat in on both Charla's interview and Brandon's interrogation. Figuratively, it was the equivalent of bringing a knife into a gunfight. In this case, a fictional knife into a missing gunfight. To begin, let's discuss where we stand in this case at this particular time. Dennis and Norma had been found dead on Tuesday. The interviews were taking place on Sunday, a mere 5 days later. In those 5 days, Brandon and Charla both uprooted their lives from college, buried their loving parents, and began to plan how their futures were going to play out now that they were both without their nurturing mother and father who'd raised them and loved them unconditionally their entire lives. Needless to say, their states of mind may not have been an optimal cognitive functioning state at this point. I haven't said this up until now, but there is a group of people who believe that Charla had some involvement in the planning and execution of her parents' murders. That, of course, is not the position of this podcast or its author, but it bears mentioning that it's out there in the public domain. With that being said, I feel as though Charla's words during this interview definitely need to be discussed in depth. You, the audience, need to receive this abundance of information in order to come to a conclusion of your own. I can only show you the road. You have to drive it. So get comfortable, strap in, and open your minds to different possibilities. So, here we go. Oh, wait. It looks as though we've run out of time for this week's episode. I know, I can hear your collective sighs now, but don't worry. Next week's episode is a good one. Until then, here's a sneak peek. See you next week.
He beat the snot out of me too. I know, good talk. Anyway, so he beat the snot out of me too because we had horse whips too. Mm-hmm. And he did that.
The buggy whips, what you call it, black call it, is a buggy whip.
Mm-hmm. So he did that, and crazy stuff, or locked me in the house for hours and hours and hours and hours. But every time I would try to walk off and go to a friend's house, he'd be like, well, what if Dad calls? What if Dad calls? You're going to get in trouble. I'm going to tell him you're not here. So then I would literally have to sit outside in the heat and the sun and just wait for him, Anyway, so that was me. But he did that. But my parents never believed me about it until one day, like, I'd call my mom for something, and I didn't hang up the phone on the way. Mm-hmm. And on accident, it was a pure accident. I don't know, somebody upstairs was thinking about me, I guess. And then he came in and did all the horsewhip thing, and all you heard was just me screaming bloody murder, and I locked myself in.
They never seen the marks from the whips.
They didn't believe me. And I locked myself in the bathroom. And he had pots and pans and cookie sheets and whatever else. Honestly, we didn't play.
The American Justice Podcast is owned and copyrighted by Atua Productions, LLC. Your host is Scott Poggensee, and your writer is C. Derick Miller. This episode has been produced and mixed by Wall Studios. The theme music for the American Justice Podcast has been created and composed by Josh DeRosa. Scripted and recorded episodes are published every Sunday morning, with follow-up Q&A episodes released on Fridays. You can find the Q&A episodes on YouTube by searching for American Justice Podcast. Atua Productions aims for this to be an interactive podcast where you, the audience, has a great amount of influence on the content of our shows. You can interact with us in several ways. First, and most preferred, is you can leave us a voicemail. Our phone number is 972-942-0444. Be sure to leave your name and the city you're calling from, along with whether or not we can use your voice on the air. If Facebook is more your style, you can log on to our Facebook page at facebook.com/American Justice Podcast. Feel free to leave a comment, or you can message us on Messenger if you have a more pressing question or issue. If you would like to blog about the show, then you can log on to AmericanJusticePodcast.com and tell us what you think there. You can find many of the documents discussed in this episode there as well. If you are a tweeter, you can also voice your opinion on Twitter at @AJusticePodcast. If you would like to support the show, you can do so in a couple different ways. First, consider visiting our Patreon page at patreon.com/AJPodcast. We have different levels of support that include t-shirts, guest call-in spots, and early access to our podcast and YouTube shows. Next, you can like, subscribe, and click the bell icon to get notifications of when we publish episodes. We would also very much appreciate it if you could give us a 5-star review. If you have any comments about the show, or more importantly, any tips on the case we're discussing, please call 972-942-0444 and leave us a message. After all, if the subject of our podcast is innocent, that means someone out there is guilty. American Justice Army? Let's find them.